Village Executive Director Lorraine Campbell. She's provided numerous presentations on regional history, public history, and museum administration. She's authored and edited 3 books on local and Michigan history topics. Her children's book, A Pocket Full of Passage, was the Michigan book at the 2009 National Book Festival. Yeah. And you might not know this, but she has a bachelor's in biology, and her master's is in history, and she has a certificate in archive management, museums. So she will share with us some science and some history and economics and business and botany as part of today's Tulip Mania presentation. Please help me welcome Lorraine Campbell.
Kind of liking this. I'm going to put on my teacher's voice. Is this volume reaching you all? Yes. Okay. If I slip, just put up your hand and I'll know that I slipped, okay? First of all, thank you, Stephanie. Does she do a wonderful job with this? I mean, really. We are now averaging 80 people every month for teas. That's fantastic. So, as she said, I'm going to take you on a real sleigh ride today. This is a fascinating story that is also taught in law school. Yeah, because it is an example of one of the original junkbonds.coms. I have done it in churches because it's about greed. And it knits together science, geography, history, and the human condition. So let's go. To start this story, we have to figure out where tulips started anyway. So we have to travel to Asia, where a lot of our wildflowers actually, or the flowers in your garden, actually originated. And we're looking specifically at an area where China bumps up against Russia and Nepal in what is known as the Tian Shan Mountains, also known as the Celestial Mountains of China. This is a particularly challenging environment for any kind of plant to survive. Half of the 120 wild species of tulips grow here. And it's rocky soil, it's windy, it's barren, it's dry. No, this is the environment. Pardon me? Oh, they're talking. Okay. So this is the kind of environment that wild tulips grew in. And they aren't the big plants like you have in your garden. They were little guys, about this tall. Not more than 6 inches, because they're hugging the rocks to protect themselves from the wind. But they were blood red. So they drew the attraction of nomadic bands of Turks who would traverse that area. And the Turks found them particularly fascinating, and they liked them because they were blood red. They attracted a warrior. In fact, if we go to the early poetry of Omar Khayyam, he equates the flower with perfection and eternity. He says, every beauty that we praise from a prior valor must raise. Beautiful face that lovers amaze becomes a flower upon which we gaze. The flower was the tulip. And notice his headdress, which we still see today. That becomes part of the name of this plant that we're going to follow. So, as these nomadic troops kind of moved across the Asian Persia, from the mountains through Persia and on to what was then known as Byzantia, they started collecting the tulips and carrying the bulbs in their satchels. Okay? And by the end of the 11th century, tribes of Turks known as Seljuks had moved out of Persia and conquered Anatolia, which is now eastern Turkey, and that was at that time part of the empire known as Byzantia. So the flowers come with them, okay? Now, the Turk that we know most was one Osman Kanganzi, who was dominant in the early 1300s. And his name got translated. In Arabic, his rule was known as the Ottoman dynasty. In Europe, it became the Ottoman Empire. Okay? So you see how we're plugging some things together. And this empire was known to be incredibly powerful, incredibly ruthless. You didn't follow their rules, off with your head, or your hand, or your foot, or your tongue, depending on your crime. But at the same time, these very ruthless warriors were passionate about beauty and about horticulture. So, tulips, these little wildflowers, became elevated to a role of prominence in their culture. Now, we have to remember that these were Islamic people, and at that time in history, before 1400, it was against Islamic law to depict anything that Allah had made with human hands. So, art that depicted the human form, portraits, pictures of plants and animals, stars, the sun, was against the law because God had made it. That's why when you look at a lot of the very old art and architecture from the Ottoman Empire, it's a lot of geometric forms and shapes, not human form or animal form. However, when archaeologists found the graves of these ancient warriors, these Seljuks, and they opened them up, they found that they had embroidered passages not only of the Quran on their undergarments, but on the backside and on the inside, they had embroidered little tulips. They broke the law. But the tulip was so important to them as a symbol that they put it on their undies. It wasn't until later in the 15 and 1600s that that rule of Islamic law disappeared, and we started to see pictures of human beings, animals, and flowers on tiles, in palaces, and in the art of the Islamic world. If you'll notice right here, what do you suppose that is? That's a tulip. Oops, why don't I just do this? So one of the major sultans, heads of an Ottoman Empire, was this gentleman, Mehmet II, the Conqueror. Now, he conquered the Byzantine Empire and overtook Constantinople in 1453. What do we know Constantinople as today? I'm sorry? Istanbul, exactly. And he built the Topkapi Palace there, which is not one building by any means. It is a city within a city, okay? He was one heck of a ruthless warrior. Killed many people, ordered the deaths of many. However, he also was one heck of a great gardener. And that is why he is depicted sniffing the tulip. So here's a picture of Constantinople, or Istanbul, and an aerial view of Topkapi Palace. Now, what you need to understand is that there was a social order, if you will, to even approaching that palace at that time. So the first court south of this gate was open to all. The second court was for soldiers and officials and visitors, in many cases traders. And that's where they'd put the heads on the sticks. Just to remind you, behave yourself. Follow the rules. The third court, no Westerners allowed. So this was only for a few of the Ottoman leaders. And way back here, that fourth imperial court, far away from the hubbub of Constantinople, overlooking the breezes off the Bosporus, was the imperial gardens, where the Sultan lived, where his harem was, and where the gardeners worked. And this is where they cultivated wildflowers and turned them into things that you have in your backyard today. So we did find that they cultivated roses. So even though we didn't have the rose presentation today, I brought it to you. They cultivated carnations, hyacinths, narcissus, and tulips. He had literally dozens of horticulturalists working in the palace, creating varieties of flowers. The ones they liked the best. So the wild tulip, remember, was tiny and it was sort of egg-shaped. Well, they wanted to preserve the red color, but they also liked this sulfur. They also liked the darkest, almost black that they could get. And they wanted to cultivate tulips with long, narrow, stiletto-shaped petals because that reminded them of swords, daggers, knives, weapons. Just a wonderful flower. In 1630, Istanbul had 80 flower shops and over 300 professional florists. Now keep in mind, these men had no concept of genetics. They were just pairing and trying to do what they could, okay, and stumbling on new varieties. Let's talk about the source of the name tulip. It was Lale to the Turks, which had the same letters in it as Allah. It was revered. It was tulipan, like that turban, according to a trader named Agir Gijslein de Goosbeck. Okay? And once it got to the Netherlands, it was Dulaban or Tuliban. And I will tell you, just over the weekend, I had breakfast at a little pastry shop in Worcester, Ohio, called Tulipan. And they served Hungarian pastries. So you can see how the word, just like Ottoman, moved around, was shifted and changed over time. We know that as traders from the West were starting to engage in commerce with the Ottomans, that they were trading more than spice. And can anyone tell me the spice that everyone was after? When we hear in history that they were looking for spices, was it cinnamon? What was the spice? Anybody have an idea? Pepper. It was pepper. Black pepper to season food, to give it that that we love. So they were also finding things like tulip bulbs. And they were making their way back to Europe. The first tulip documented in Europe is documented through the writings of Johann Heinrich Huet from Augsburg, Bavaria in April 1559. Now listen to what he says. I find this fascinating. I saw this plant displayed, springed from a seed that had come from Byzantia, okay, so we're there in Istanbul, with a single beautifully red flower formed of 8 petals, which 4 were outside and the rest within, so he's describing it botanically. It had, here's the kicker, a very sweet, soft, subtle scent which soon disappeared. Have any of you ever smelt a tulip? Like roses and carnations, we've bred the scent, the aroma out of the flower in exchange for big, showy petals. How sad. The spread of tulips was documented, and it flew quickly across Europe. Look at the dates. 1572, Vienna. 10 years later, England. By the 1590s, it was in Germany. And just 5 years later, in the south of France. So there was a network. We think of this as a very long ago time, not a lot of communication. There was communication. There were satchels. There was trade. There were letters and packets going back and forth between groups. It took time, but it happened. One of the guys who was probably most responsible for the spread of tulips in Europe was this gentleman, born in France as Charles de la Cuisse, and he was Catholic. As a young man, he studied law in Ghent, and then, like a lot of individuals at that time, he became upset with the Pope, with Catholicism, and he started to follow the Protestant Reformation. And like a lot of men who rebuked Catholicism, he changed his name. He Latinized it. He became Carolus Clusius. And he said, I ain't studying law anymore. He wanted to study science. And so he moved to Germany and studied botany. He was known to communicate with a lot of other scientists, sending them letters, his notes on plants, seeds, bulbs, etc. So he, we feel, is responsible for a lot of that traveling for tulips. In 1573, he moved to Vienna at the behest of Maximilian II, who requested that Clusius establish an herb garden in Vienna. He was also interested in science. Now, keep in mind that Vienna at this time was a mere 50 miles from the front. He was on the frontier of the Ottoman Empire. So here, Clusius had an opportunity to interact with, talk to, exchange with the members of the Ottoman Empire. When Maximilian died, he was succeeded by Rudolf II, who was a Catholic, had no use for the science, had no use for Clusius or flowers. And Clusius moves on, he loses his position, and he moves to Leiden, university town. And there he wrote a book on the taxonomy of plants called The Rare Plant History, the history of rare plants, in 1601. And in this book, he describes as a scientist the characteristics of all these plants, including 14 species of tulips. Today, we recognize 121 species in that tulip family, which are part of the large family of lilies. He also described the cultivars that came from those species. He drew pictures of them. This is an incredible primary resource that we still have access to today. Now I have to give you that science experiment, or science lesson. You still with me? Okay. So, where do tulips come from? Not geographically, but what do we have to put in the ground to make a tulip grow? You're absolutely right. But did you know that tulips also can grow from seeds? Historically, tulips produce seeds as well as grew from bulbs. Now, the seed has genetic variation. We're putting basically an egg and a sperm together, right? Pollen going to a seed, an ova inside the flower, combining and creating a genetically new plant. Not so with now, a tulip that grew from a seed, it would take 7 years before it had stored enough carbohydrates in its roots and in its stems so that it had energy to produce a flower. That's a long time. That's what orchids do in the wild, 7 to 10 years to produce a flower. A bulb, however, absorbs the sugars that the leaves make and stores it, and that's basically a little starch pocket, and it can produce a flower within 2 to 3 years. If you're cultivating tulips, that's better. However, the plant, the new plant that comes if you break off an offset of a bulb is genetically identical to its parent. It is not the combination that you find in a seed. So, bulbs produce by offsets just like a head of garlic. Actually, garlic and tulips are in the same family. They're lilies. So if you broke off a clove of garlic, just like you broke off an offset from a tulip, you could use that to produce a genetically identical plant, okay? On average, one bulb will produce 2 to 3 offsets per year. So you can get up to 3 new tulip plants every year. And that original bulb will continue to produce offsets for 3 years before it dies. So if I'm cultivating tulips, I'm not going to focus on the seeds. I'm going to focus on the bulbs, right? And that is exactly what happened in Europe. It was all about the bulb. The one thing that they didn't realize were variegated tulips, the kind that have stripes. That wasn't caused by genetics. It was caused by a virus. Who'd have thunk it? Now we have to switch and we have to talk about the Dutch economy. So put your science to the side for a minute. Now we're going to look at this story through the lens of the economy. In the 1500s, the Dutch economy was very interesting and not unlike what we have here in the United States today. Those who were the wealthiest were regents. Equate that with Bill Gates, with Mark Zuckerberg, with any of the CEOs of international corporations that we know about today. Worth incredible sums of money that we can't imagine. They do not work for a living necessarily anymore, but easily can live off their investments. Those were the ruling class of the republic. These were not necessarily politicians, but businessmen who were worth a tremendous amount of money. And they made between 10 and 30,000 guilders a year just off their investments, living high on the hog. Many of them were known as connoisseurs. Their hobby was gardening and cultivating flowers like tulips. It was all the rage if you wanted to impress a woman to give her a lovely flower when we were going to go to the ball that she would insert into her dress right there. It was a way of paying homage to that woman who you thought was priceless, valued beyond gold. And men were known to pay 1,000 guilders for a flower to give to their lady fair. One step down in the social strata from the regents were merchants. Now, they reinvested the profits from their businesses every year. They were working hard. They may have owned ships. They may have owned mills. They may have owned multiple businesses, but they were working. They were the heads of their companies. Their average income per year was 1,500 to 3,000 guilders. So you see the economic disparity between those two classes. Below them were clerks and shop owners, the baker, the butcher. making 500 to 1,000 guilders on average in a year. Again, much lower in the social strata than even the merchants. And below them, the artisans. The guy who is sitting in his house weaving, the guy pounding horseshoes, living on 300 guilders a year. Okay. If I'm making 300 guilders a year, and I see somebody buying a tulip for 1,000 guilders, I may start to get an idea. And that is what happened in the Netherlands. Cultivating tulips started to become a new business. Let's do it and get rich quick. Maybe I should sell my spinning wheel or my loom and invest in tulips. Heck, anybody can grow a flower, right? And all the rage was to find the prettiest tulip. They were buying them by their color and shape, having no idea of their genetics. The Semper Augusta was the creme de la creme of tulips. It was pure white with black stripes. It was elegant. And the word on the street was there were only about 12 of them in existence. So people would pay incredible sums of money if they could come across a Semper Augustus. One connoisseur rejected 3,000 guilders for what he felt was the Semper Augustus bulb he owned. He said it's worth more than that. So not only Semper Augustus, but the new color, the new variety, the tulip no one else had. How much can I get for it? So we started to see a whole new group of people flooding the economy in the Netherlands. There were horticulturalists in the Netherlands who were flower growers, who propagated flowers. That was their living. But now they're going to focus on tulips, and they're going to do it for profit. And they're going to do it in a way that the wealthy regents, the connoisseurs, did not. They weren't paying attention to the biology of the plant. We'll get into it. There were also a group known as rhizomati, who were more disreputable. They collected flowers and bulbs and seeds from France, and they bought and sold them. They had reputations of lying, of selling ordinary bulbs and claiming they were rare bulbs, and you weren't going to know it until the thing popped up out of the ground and made a flower, and by that time I can be hundreds of miles away, right? Below them were people who were herbalists and peddled folk medicines. They were peddlers known as apothecaries, and they were selling aphrodisiacs and things to cure what ails you, and they got into the tulip trade also in the same kind of disreputable way. They were promoting tulip bulbs not only for their beauty, but they said, you know, this one would give you great sexual prowess, it would cure any disease, it would make you live forever. They were known to wear black robes and caps. Below them were those florists, the guy who sold his blacksmithing tools, his cobbler tools, his loom to buy tulips and just get in the trade, and he wanted to just get rich quick. Okay? So we got to go back to the flower for a minute. How many of you actually grow tulips in your backyard? Okay. So when the tulip flowers in April and the petals fall off, do you cut the whole plant back? What do? You let the leaves wilt, reabsorb the sugars into the bulb, because you know now the bulb is making the offsets. If you're going to share tulips with your neighbor, when do you pull them? late summer, early fall, right? Because you want to plant that tulip by September in the ground so it can overwinter, establish itself, and then sprout anew in the spring. That is what the connoisseurs did. But that wasn't going to get a florist rich quick. So the florists started to sell tulip bulbs when they were still in the ground. Oh. So I would go, come here. Come here. So I would go to my dear friend, and I would say, I have a tulip bulb you want. It's got black on it. You're going to love it. I will sell it to you for the princely sum of 100 guilders, 10% down. And then you can come back in the fall and you can pull the bulb, okay? So give me the guilders. Then I'll give you a piece of paper. Now the problem is she doesn't have 90 guilders to pay me in the fall. So she's going to turn around and go to a neighbor and say, I have this paper for a tulip bulb. It's worth 200 guilders. I'll give it to you for 30% down. Here's the paper. You take the money. You see how this is going? Thank you, ladies. They called it tulip mania today. It was trading on the wind. It was futures trading. That piece of paper that I sold her might trade hands 5 or 10 times by the time that that tulip bulb could be pulled out of the ground. And that tulip bulb increased in value 10 times because each one had to cover their back, right? Because they didn't have the money to buy it. It got to a point where in the summer of 1633, a house in Horham sold for the princely sum of 3 tulip bulbs. It still stands. There's a brass plaque on the door with 3 tulips on it. Let's look at inflation, shall we? The general of generals, one particularly popular variety of tulips, in December of 1634 sold for that princely sum of 100 guilders. Remember, that's the annual salary of a candle maker. A year later, 166 guilders. 1 year later, 244 guilders. Same tulip bulb. By January of 1637, 3 years later, it's worth 732 guilders. Holy smokes. A lousy flower bulb. Florists bought and sold the tulips in the ground. They started selling the bulb by its weight. How big was that offset? They called it an ace. 1 ace was equal to 2 1,000ths of an ounce, or 1/120th of a gram. And you need to understand that at this time in the Netherlands, there was an established stock market, just like we have the New York Stock Exchange today. But all of this trading was outside the stock market. It was not legal. It just happened. It was one of the first futures markets. Now, where did they trade? In the bar. At this time in Europe, water was undrinkable because our raw sewage went right into the river next to the house. The dead animal was floating in the canal. Water was considered completely unsafe to drink. Thus, people drank beer. Now, why was beer safer to drink than water? How do you make beer? You have to boil the water. They didn't know they were killing the bacteria, but they were sanitizing it, and the alcohol was also helping to kill the bacteria. So if we look at the town of Harlem, there were 30,000 residents. There was one pub for every 20 people. They were I know. This guy in the beer t-shirt, he's going, well. What's wrong with that? 120,000 pints of beer were produced per day in the Netherlands. That's 5.5 million gallons a year out of 100 breweries. Now, they were drinking it kind of watered down a little bit, but they were drinking beer. And they were drinking it, man, woman, and child, throughout the day. On top of that, the taverns didn't really have windows and were heated by burning peat, sod. So you had smoky, dark taverns where people half-cracked are buying and selling tulip bulbs. This is a prescription for disaster. Tulip mania, just like any .com, reached a fever pitch. It only lasted a couple of years, really. And it peaked out with the auction of some poor guy named Wouter Winkler, who had the audacity to die in February of 1637, leaving 7 orphans. Now, as Al Eicher will say next month, orphans were considered lower than slime through most of our history because they were a bother. We had to feed and clothe these brats who didn't have parents to support them. So we can make them work for a living or we can turn them into beggars, but they're certainly not an asset. So obviously we want to do something with these orphans, and hopefully Wouter's estate will keep them off our collective hands. So they looked at his belongings, which included one tulip bulb, which fetched 5,200 guilders at auction. Holy smokes. Well, that solves the orphan's problem. He got 90,000 guilders for the remaining bulbs in his estate. That set up all of his 7 children with 13,000 guilders each, if carefully invested, would keep them off the public dole for the rest of their lives. They were set. The problem was the next, and just to show you what 3,000 guilders could buy, there's the shopping list. 8 pigs, 4 cows, 12 sheep, 24 tons of wheat, 48 tons of rye, a couple hogsheads of wine, some beer, a couple tons of butter, cheese, a silver drinking cup, a pack of clothes, a bed with a mattress, and a boat. What happened, though, is very, very soon, within a couple of days after Wouter's death, a group of florists got together in the pub, and there was a regular procedure that they followed. They actually had catalogs that described the plants. They would carefully write down their bids. There was an exchange. There was a procedure. And so a tulip bulb came up. Who's going to bid? Nothing happened. Nobody wanted it. Not one person wanted to buy that tulip bulb. Everybody had enough. There wasn't a newer variety. Cost too much. I'm done. Not this time. And just like that, just like when we experienced the fall of the .coms, it was over. That's why they still teach it in law school. History repeats itself. It went bust. Tulips were just flower bulbs again. The aftermath. Well, it went into the courts. The government had to decide. Remember, this was trade outside the legal stock market. So the ruling came down. The buyer who might be way down at the end of the aisle because you had sold to you and you and you and you and you. So you got to this point, that buyer is released from their contract for 3.5% of the original sale price. So people took a loss. The bulb ownership reverted to the owner. Aren't you happy? There was no effect on the Dutch economy because it wasn't legal trade. And the connoisseurs, the regents, they still had their quote-unquote millions. They went on fat and happy. But that's not quite the end of the story, because at the same time, there were members of the Dutch country, of the Netherlands, as well as across Europe, who were looking towards the New World. And they were going to take a shot on this new world that they had heard about. They were seeking freedom of religion, a new start, better land, better opportunity. So they packed their satchels and they crossed the Atlantic Ocean, and many of the Dutch went to the New Netherlands, which is where? New York. Thank you. And what do you suppose they had in the bottom of their satchel? A tulip bulb. So Susan Fenimore Cooper, the brother of James, last of the Mohicans, wrote, "And rude men, as many of the Hollanders were, they had a delicate eye for the flowers, too. Very soon indeed, patches of flowers began to appear about the doors of some of those log cabins and bark huts. The tulip was already a mania in Holland, and tulip roots were sent to the New Netherlands, perchance as the hope, the spotted cow, or the broken heart." And so, tulips traveled, didn't they? From the mountainsides in China to the palaces of the sultans, to growers and horticulturalists and florists who had a dream, all the way to your backyard. Thank you.